This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Look for the big red button that says Patreon, click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. My guest today is a historian of the Middle East at Skidmore College in New York, who specializes in late Ottoman history. His book, The Ottoman World of Sports, Refashioning Bodies, Men and Communities in Late Imperial Istanbul, is forthcoming by the University of Texas Press. Dr. Murat Yildiz, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with a general question, perhaps. How do you define physical culture as an object of historical inquiry? And when did it emerge as such? Not necessarily in the Ottoman context, but where along the historical spectrum?
So I understand physical culture in a couple of ways. One at a global level and at an imperial level. During the mid-19th century, what you have across the globe is a set of movements, ideas, new conceptions of the body that develop, in which the body is identified as an object that can and should be refashioned, that has the potential to develop physically in more productive ways. And that is something that we find iterations of with the emergence of the modern sporting movement, with the modern Olympic Games. In late Ottoman Istanbul, which is part of this global shift.
What were the origins of that shift in the mid-19th century? What sort of purpose was it trying to address?
I mean, it's in origins that are connected in new understandings of medicine, new understandings of biology, new understandings of science. All of these, in addition to new forms of urbanization, industrialization, all of these are intersecting and facilitate new understandings of exercise.
So in the late Ottoman Istanbul, you said it was part of that global movement. How did it find its local iteration?
In a couple of ways. One is that, we start to see the translation of gymnastics textbooks that Ottomans are translating from French, from German into Ottoman Turkish and Armenian. And these are textbooks. What we also start to see are the development of books themselves in these languages. So Ottomans are producing them themselves.
And does it have any sort of like local flair, local character to it?
Let me take a step back because I try to understand physical culture at a couple of different levels. One is at this educator-translator level, which are connected to imperial institutions, which are connected to new forms of education, and that plays an instrumental role in legitimizing physical exercise as an educational moral project. And this is something that transcends the various different ethno-religious divisions of the capital of the Ottoman Empire.
And it has a political scope.
It has a political scope. I mean, depending on how we understand political, right? In a very narrow sense, these ideas are very popular amongst military reformers. So the idea that how do we build a strong, productive, healthy society? One of the ways in which we do that is we reform the military, right? We defend literally the borders of the empire. That is one kind of very statist approach, but that finds echoes and reverberations in other non-state sponsored schools. So Ottoman Istanbul is a city that's made up of a multiplicity of different languages, of ethnicities, religions, and you have this kind of competitive market taking place in which people are competing literally over the bodies and minds of young men. To a lesser extent, girls, but more so boys, and
With a view to doing what?
with a view to creating strong, healthy, modern young men for their communities. So you have private Armenian schools, you have private Jewish schools, you have private Greek schools, in addition to state-sponsored government schools.
So you see it as part of a broader educational effort?
This is one of the major threads through which, or the mechanisms through which it spreads. Because for any of us who've gone to school and have experienced physical education, some of us are enamored by it, and some of us are like, oh, this is really boring. How do we get out of gym class? And that was an experience of some Ottoman Istanbulites. There's another experience, which is, oh, wow, this is incredible. I want to do this outside of the boundaries of school. And that's where we find the kind of emergence of sports clubs.
So this really takes us to perhaps a two-tier approach to sports in general. One is really the educational or statist, and the other is sport or physical activity, physical culture as entertainment. How do you see the connection between the two?
I see the connection between the two. I mean, there's a historian by the name of Bob Edelman at UC San Diego, retired faculty member. And he proposes this approach of thinking of modern sport as serious fun. So there's a serious component and there's a fun component, and I see that manifesting itself in late Imperial Istanbul, in which you have educators that are firmly committed to this idea of sporting as a means through which young men develop moral characteristics. They are working out their body, and that act of working out the body in and of itself is a praiseworthy moral endeavor. But some young guys just want to hang out. They want to go to the sports club. Why? Because this is part of the argument that it becomes a component of a new masculine, upwardly mobile identity that transcends ethno-religious divisions. And so some young men just want to go hang out and become a member of a sports club and to play, but also to go to the library, to go cruise the city. These are all, people are attracted to clubs for different reasons. I see clubs as a central site in which physical culture is being localized in the imperial capital.
What was the effect on, you said that Istanbul was this big city full of different people, different collective, ethno-religious collectives.
Correct.
To what extent did this, I don't know if fragmentation is really the right word, but this division into a sports club, this culture feed into those divisions, perhaps amplified them? This is part of what I asked you earlier about the political scope.
I see. Yeah, well, it's an interesting question because it's connected to a historiographical tension, which is, do we understand communal building as a political endeavor? And I'm suspicious of that.
Do we not? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Tell me why.
Because I think it depends on how we understand the empire at this late imperial moment, and the empire is made up of a multiplicity of ethno-religious communities. The empire is undergoing a profound amount of transformation at this moment when they're experimenting with an Ottoman identity that transcends various different religious backgrounds. So the idea that you can be a good Ottoman citizen if you're a Muslim, but also if you're a Jew or a Christian. But even more important than that, the notion that in order to be a good Ottoman, one needs to be a good Jew. One needs to be a good Armenian. One needs to be a good Greek. So people are experimenting with that. And historians have taken a lot of time and attention or dedicated a lot of time and attention to investigating these processes. And a lot of the attention has been looking at the columns of newspapers, right? Debates in parliament. What does it mean to be an Ottoman? How people have contested that discursively. I'm indebted to that historiographical tradition, these contributions. What I'm trying to look at is not sports as a venue through which we see these political developments, but as actual sites in which people are working out the meaning of what I refer to as an imperial mode of living.
But to you as a historian, you have the benefit of hindsight.
Correct.
I mean, the work of the historian is really twofold. On the one hand, it's trying to understand the way people saw that current moment in which they lived, and also trying to interpret it in retrospect. Now, that feeds into my question about whether it's, in order to be a good Ottoman, you need to be a good Jew or a good Greek or a good Armenian. Or maybe when you're a good Jew, it works against your Ottoman identity. What do you think, looking back on it?
Yeah.
I mean, in which direction did the sports club pull Ottoman citizens?
Well, this is another point that I want to make, is that it's I'm actually not exclusively also looking at Ottoman citizens. It's not a tension of the book, but it's something that I'm very intentional about, and that is trying to understand Istanbulite as an identity. I could have written this book in a multiplicity of different ways, one of which is the kind of macro understanding of physical culture across the empire. In which case, you see gymnasts in Jaffa. You see people swimming in the sea in Beirut. You see sportsmen in Izmir, football players in Salonika. That's a doable history. I wanted to write a history of the imperial capital that brings together all of its upwardly mobile young men and together through a single frame. And when doing so, I'm going to be addressing your question, which is, how do I study, and this is the tension, right? How do you study the time period on its own terms? The project cuts off when? At the First World War. And, the reflection that I make at the end of the book is kind of thinking about how the First World War, we start to see the coming apart of this Ottoman world of sports. But I do think it's incredibly important to treat that late imperial moment on its own terms, and yes, we have the benefit of hindsight, but if we suspend what we know about what comes to happen in 1915, when we see, the founder of the Armenian sports journal Marmnamars penning incredibly sharp, blistering critiques of the general inspector of physical culture in the empire, who's an Ottoman Muslim, and has no reservations about these critiques. It says something about that late moment. Now, one person can read it and say, yes, but it's building up to the empire falling apart. That's one way of interpreting it. I see contingency as incredibly important here, and I see part of my role is to treat that late imperial moment on its own terms.
Mm-hmm. I want to spend some more time on that very interesting methodological point that you make about Istanbul as distinctive from the empire. To what extent, I mean, there's probably a very porous boundary between the two, but to what extent can you think about Istanbul as a microcosm of the empire, and to what extent is it really a space on its own? Maybe you can say more about that. Yeah,
I remember, I'll share an anecdote, and I won't share the name of the institution, but I remember early on applying for jobs. And I received a question from an individual interviewing me, in which he said, "So you're a historian of the late Ottoman Empire, specifically of Istanbul, but like, how representative is Istanbul? Like, it's not, right? And like, it looks nothing like any other city. It's not like Damascus, it's not like Cairo, it's not representative." And I said, he felt very proud of himself for asking the question. And my response was the following: no, Istanbul's not representative of the region. I mean, he actually said, to what extent is it representative of the Middle East? I said, but the Middle East is made up of non-urban centers, right? So it's mainly non-urban. I'm an urban historian, right? At the time period, the Ottoman Empire's capital is Istanbul. It's one of the major cities to which people living across the imperial domains look to. So can we think about it comparatively with Cairo, Alexandria, Damascus, Izmir, Salonika? Yeah, I think we can. Can we also think about it as a major urban center in a global scope of, can we think about it alongside of Berlin? Could we think alongside of it London, of Stockholm? Many of these physical culture enthusiasts would have liked to. It's a way of them of challenging the centrality of Europe. And I see myself trying to think globally about urban centers. And this kind of physical culture movement that spreads during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And also trying to, and I make a point of this in the book, that I'm not looking at Damascus, Salonika. I'm not looking at these places not because I don't think they're very lively, vibrant urban centers. My intellectual motivation behind this project is to write a very textured history, a lived history of the imperial capital, something that I think by and large, historians have struggled to do, and if you want, we could talk about this.
Yeah, I'm trying to follow that argument and think. And again, going back to my question, what is it about the imperial capital that makes it stand apart on its own?
On the one hand, nothing. On the other hand, everything. I mean, in the sense of, it is the cultural political center of the empire. That is one. But this is not the motivation that I have for studying it. I see it as one of the most important potential case studies for how to study urban lived history that has posed incredible challenges to historians. And I'll give you an example as to why. It's connected to the profound ethno-religious and linguistic diversity of the city. How do you study Istanbul in a way that captures, and not in a romanticized way, but how do you capture that lived set of different social variables? People have done so slightly differently. One has been to acknowledge that, look, the field is overly dominated by historians that are looking at Ottoman Turkish sources. Now, Ottoman Turkish sources are, the documents that make up the imperial government, right? Sure. But you also have a very robust, production of ideas, lived experiences in Ladino, in Greek, in Armenian, right? How do you capture that? And one approach is to be, well, let's look at Ottoman Jews very much in the context of that late imperial moment, right? And scholars have made a very concerted effort to frame lived Jewish experiences in that imperial setting.
And that layered existence is something that is characteristic of Istanbul specifically.
Some historians are making that argument, right? That we need to basically rewrite into the historical narrative, both rewrite them discursively and to rewrite them because many of them have been erased physically due to a number of different historical processes, rewrite them into the historical narrative. And people have made that contribution by looking at Ottoman Jews, by looking at Ottoman Armenians, by looking at Ottoman Greeks. And what I'm saying is this is incredibly important, but it's one keyhole through which we're looking at the city. And I had something more ambitious, which is how do we bring them together through a single frame? And not to do it in a way in which I treat them as separate islands. But also not to romanticize and the idea that they're all coming together. And this is something that we can talk about, potentially how you can hear people frame sporting as a set of activities that brings people together. It's not that I'm inherently suspicious of that, but I really try to listen to the documents in which they are very much using sporting activities as a means to build differences.
Well, competitive sports also brings people against each other. It's not just together.
No, this is true. It brings people. People are competing against other teams, and this is also a tension that emerges at the time period where some educators are saying, there's a problem with the amount of competition on the pitch, right? And this is the reason. This one individual by the name of Burhan Bey or Burhanettin Bey. He changes his name later after the Republic, the creation of the Turkish Republic. But he makes this argument that the competition between leading football teams that are dominated by Ottoman Turks are actually motivating them to recruit non-Turkish players, which for him is a problem. And so it's the competition that is motivating them to create heterogeneous organizations. And what they need to do is to remain committed to the idea of sport as a means through which one builds community, an ethno-religious community.
And so there's always in the background, and I'm sorry to be pesky about, again, the political scope of sports here, but would it be simplistic to look at it at the emergence of physical culture in the Ottoman Empire as some sort of like a modernizing and westernizing force? You did say that it started elsewhere and was brought over. Was it seen like that as perhaps a foreign influence that either should be adopted or fought against?
Yes and no. I'm somewhat suspicious of the framing of these activities as inherently Western, and I'll explain how in a second. Eugene Weber writes the seminal study, Turning Peasants into Frenchmen, and I remember early on after I finished the dissertation, somebody asking me, well, isn't everything you're doing just derivative history? Or, aren't the Ottomans just trying to be like the Europeans? And in which case, what is the point of your project? Why don't you look at something more authentic, like authentic Eastern sporting? And I said, for example, and this is a towering historian. She said, I don't know, camel races in Istanbul. And I said, I don't know if camel race is taking place in Istanbul in the late 19th, early 20th century. This is a bustling metropolis with nearly 1 million people, very urban. And I think there was something really interesting in what she was getting at. And my response to that, after I established what Istanbul looked like, was that, and I raised this question, Eugene Weber's seminal study, he seems to be showing that gymnastics are novel. Right, there's a process in which they have to be localized, and I'm fascinated by that. And I'm fascinated by that approach that he takes. The study is not dedicated to gymnastics, but he's showing that the building of a modern France is a process, right? And I see something similar, but also different in the Ottoman realms, whereby yes, people see physical education, sporting activities as ideas, practices, spaces, and activities that emerge in or that are popularized in the West. And the reason why I paused and I said emerged, because there's also many of these individuals also try to establish that we have a long-standing history of performing exercise. Gymnastics manuals that are written in Ottoman Turkish sometimes will include a saying of the Prophet Muhammad about, the importance of knowledge of the body as a pre-modern example of physical strength and emphasis on taking care of one's body. So there is a process in which they're pulling from the West. But at the same time, the West is also developing these ideas. There's nothing authentically Western about them, right? So if we see it in a kind of global scope in which we try to decenter the West, not just for the sake of decentering it, but really thinking this as a modern process, the Ottoman Empire doesn't look as derivative.
Mm-hmm. Among the protagonists of your work, there are the Jews of Istanbul.
Yep.
And Jewish history in the modern period is usually regarded as a dual or perhaps ambivalent process. On the one hand, increased integration into the broader citizenship, and this is maybe something you also want to talk about, like the concept of an Ottoman citizen with relation to the Jews, or irrespective of it. And the other way is also like this the history of persecution that rears its ugly head on occasion. How do you see? What are your conclusions about the Jewish history of modern Istanbul with regards to sports, Jewish sporting clubs, etc.?
I'll say the following: when I started this as a dissertation project, when I went off to do dissertation research in Istanbul, it looked very different. And one of the important moments before I set off to go to Istanbul was reading Todd Pressner's study on muscular Judaism. And there's a very simple statement that he makes, and that is the first Jewish gymnastics club was not established in Central Europe. It was established in Constantinople. And this is a reference to an article in Die Welt. And, this was really important to me. And this is another project that I want to kind of develop, and that is how to understand muscular Judaism in a way in which takes very seriously the important contributions in Central Europe, but also to kind of decenter it and to think about it as a global process, but also as something that's taking place across urban centers of the Middle East. Now, to come back to your initial question, I see these Ottoman Jews and non-Ottoman Jews of Istanbul, because you have Ottoman citizens and not Ottoman citizens that think of Istanbul as home, as part of this global physical culture movement that is being localized, and they're central important actors in this process of localization of sporting. They are working within communal spaces, and at the same time, they're also shaping this imperial physical culture. And so this is part of the argument that I'm making, is that people are working out these kind of shared civic understandings of the body, of masculinity, of exercise. And they're doing it in a linguistically plural way, but they're doing them in largely ethnically and religiously homogenous spaces. So Ottoman Jews and non-Ottoman Jews in Istanbul are working these ideas out in Jewish schools. They're also working them out in Jewish sporting clubs. And the earliest iteration is the Jüdische Turnverein Constantinople, which then kind of establishes itself after the Ottoman Revolution in 1908 as the Maccabi Jewish Gymnastics Society. And they're very much working within a series of different Jewish communities in the plural, and they're also contributing to this broader urban sports culture at the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, just out of curiosity, what was the interplay between Ottoman Jews and non-Ottoman Jews? I mean, in terms of numbers, relationships, contacts.
Yeah, I mean, they're not a majority of the city. I mean, there's a much smaller number of Ottoman Jews in Istanbul than, for example, in Salonika. Salonika is this bustling urban center with arguably over 50% of the population being Jewish.
It was the largest Jewish city at some point, right? But I mean, before the 19th century, but right?
It's especially before. Yeah. I defer to the scholarship of Devin Nahr, and but specifically, Rodrigue. Obviously, Rodrigue looms large over all of these conversations. But he's the, as we say, the Sheikh al-Shuyukh, and he, Nahr's done an incredible job of showing just how important that community was and those lived experiences, and how central the transformations of Salonika shapes that community. Istanbul's Jewish communities is under 10%, right? Under 10% of the city. Yes, there's studies that have looked at how important roles they've played in high echelons of urban life.
But also, as opposed to Salonika, it's a lot less endemic then, right? People came and went. I mean, it's a lot more fleeting, dynamic sort of community, isn't it?
It's a really interesting choice of words you just used, because this is one of the things that I'm committed to doing when looking at Istanbul is seeing it as a hub. It's a hub that attracts Jewish individuals across Europe, and in different directions, right? You see, especially after 1908, look, pre-1908 in 1895, you have the creation of Jüdische Turnverein Constantinople. As the title suggests, it's a German-speaking organization that's connected to German-speaking Jews of the capital that are identifying the cachet of German as a language, which you're also seeing at this time. And I defer to Rodrigue on this, who's done incredible work on the Alliance that shows the significance of French. So you can see an important kind of shift taking place with the organization rebranding itself under a French title after 1908, and taking on this very different name. And they use an Ottoman name, they use a French name. I'm somewhat reticent to refer to it as a single community, because actually many sources at the time don't refer to it as a single community. They refer to it as Jewish communities in the plural. And part of the mission of Maccabi is to actually try to think of it as a single community, right? And it's not just easily divided between Ashkenazi and Sephardim, but really as multiple different classed experiences. Yes, obviously, Ashkenazim and Sephardim play an important divide here, but it's also beyond that. There's also linguistic divisions as well, and Maccabi and Maccabi's trying to establish itself as an organization that's committed to building a single Jewish community. That and this we can come back to. This is an organization that is openly Zionist, and also openly very committed to the Imperial project, and a very polarizing one within Istanbulite Jewish circles.
Looking at the trends that you describe in the book, I know this is beyond the scope of the book, but to what extent have they persisted after the establishment of the Turkish Republic? And to what extent was it really a break-off point?
It's a good question. The book cuts off at the First World War, but when I actually started the project, I actually wanted to take it up until the early Republic. I wanted to actually challenge this kind of neat political division, and as the project grew to include different actors, and to at a certain point the methodological driving force was to actually bring these different individuals together through a single frame. I realized that I would spread myself too thin if I carried on to the early Republic. But with that said, Maccabi, for example, lives on past the early Republic. I see reports about them in voluntary association, Ottoman official forms. There's other various different Jewish organizations that carry on some of that legacy, sporting but also educational as well. So Jewish life does not end.
But also in general, not just Jewish, all the community. The meaning of community of the nation is very different under the Republic than what it was under the Empire,
Correct.
Isn't it?
Yes.
How did the whole physical culture correspond to that shift?
The end of the book, I open with a reflection on a series of articles from an Ottoman Turkish newspaper that talk about the history of basically our sporting clubs, and the possessive is interesting, right? And so they list a number of different predominantly Turkish organizations: Beşiktaş, Galatasaray, Fenerbahçe are leading ones, but there's also other ones. The Süleymaniye Physical Training Club is another one, and that to me is important because they're sketching a historical narrative of Ottoman sporting during the early days of the Turkish Republic that pepper the conversation with references to Ottoman Jews to Armenians and Greeks. But they're not the major actors of the story in these articles. And these are articles that are featured in a kind of cultural magazine. But this is super important to me because what I see happening is there's something, on the one hand, it's deeply Republican. One way to think of it is that this is a reflection of the Republican project of building a Turkish nation. And this is something that many of us kind of don't take very seriously, that it is a deeply diverse Turkish identity. The project is really of building out of a multiplicity of different Muslim ethnic backgrounds, creating a Turkish one. But there's an erasure, and so one way of thinking is, okay, the empire is trying to, the Turkish Republic is attempting to do that, and erasing Armenians, Greeks, and Jews. My point is, yes, it's deeply Republican, but it's also deeply imperial in that, in the way in which the sporting world does think of itself, and the actors think of themselves as the means through which there's communal building that's going on. The difference is that there's a difference between empire and there's a difference between republic. There is a difference, and it's not, as many historians have pointed this out, it's not as neat as a light on and off switch, right? There's an argument to be made that there's a lot more continuity during that early Republican time. But there's also, the First World War is incredibly messy. The occupation of Istanbul is incredibly messy. There's an immense amount of uncertainty as to what this actually is. They're not thinking of establishing a Turkish republic. They're thinking about how to preserve and to refashion that empire.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Murat, Yildiz, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And also many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto a Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and now on Blue Sky as well. But most important, join us next time for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.